Donald Trump currently faces four separate criminal proceedings. One in South Florida brought by the Biden Justice Department through special counsel prosecutor Jack Smith, which is the case that charges him with mishandling or pilfering without authorization, top secret, and other classified documents, and he's charged there under the Espionage Act. There are two cases that deal with Trump's post-election conduct that claim that he was essentially attempting to subvert democracy, a federal case in Washington, D.C., also with Jack Smith in the Biden Justice Department, and then one in Atlanta with an obviously Democratic Party prosecutor who has her own problems. Those cases, to the extent that you compare them, do assert serious charges if there were convictions. Trump could be convicted, for example, under the Espionage Act of taking classified material on purpose that he wasn't authorized to take and then refusing to give them back, or he could be convicted of subverting democracy and therefore attempting to launch a coup. Those are serious charges to be convicted of. We've gone over many times the weaknesses, the severe weaknesses in those cases, but at least if you were to talk about convictions of that sort, you could see them having a very consequential impact on how many Americans perceive Donald Trump. I don't think that's the case for this criminal proceeding, in part because I think the perception will be that it's about nothing more than Donald Trump's relationship with Stormy Daniels and the attempt to cover that up. And I think in the 1990s, Americans showed when they continued to support Bill Clinton by fairly large amounts and even gave the Democratic Party the victory in 1998 in the midterms at the height of the Monica Lewinsky and Paula Jones scandal, that American voters don't really care that much about what they perceive to be personal or private lives. They don't care about that with their fellow citizens. They don't really care about it in their leaders. What they really care about most is that the president or people who are elected actually do things to improve their lives. Material improvement of their lives is by far the thing that drives them when they go to the ballot box. We've seen that over and over. But because of that, precisely because of that, we know that the American media is going to engage in endless efforts and depicting this in the most melodramatic way to talk about Donald Trump as a serious felon, as somebody who now faces jail time. They'll emphasize over and over that this is the first time in American history that that an American president has been convicted in all of American history. So let's look at this ABC News graphic of the trial, which will give you a sense of already how dramatic the media is being. Now, it is true that there were 34 felonies, 34 counts, separate counts, and you see here all the red bars showing that the jury found him guilty on all of them. So you look at this and you think, oh my, that's really overwhelming. The jury found him guilty 34 times. In reality, it's all the same crime. It's just that each different time that this entry was made into the bookkeeping of the Trump Organization, the prosecutor charged him with either 2 or 3 different crimes, but it's the same crime just reoccurring every month. In reality, he's been convicted of one act that the jury found him guilty for, and that is the act of purposely manipulating the internal documents of the Trump Organization by hiding what the payments were to Michael Cohen, what they were for, and secondarily, the jury found that they were being hidden for some sort of illegal or corrupt motive. That's what the jury really found. Now, Trump obviously has the right to appeal, but I think there's very little chance, and I worked in the Manhattan legal system for 13 years. I know how these courts function, how they work. I can't imagine an appellate court, let alone the Supreme Court in New York, assessing this trial and issuing decisions about whether the jury verdict and the conviction should be overruled before the 2024 election. We're just already a few months away from that. So it seems very likely that Trump will head into the 2024 election as a convicted felon. The other question, though, that really looms large here is whether Trump will receive any prison time from Judge Merchan, who has presided over this trial in a very transparently politicized way. And we talked about this last night, that Manhattan is one of the most anti-Trump, pro-Democratic Party enclaves that you can find anywhere in the country. I lived in Manhattan and worked in Manhattan for almost 15 years, went to law school there for another 3, and finding a Republican in Manhattan is almost as difficult as finding a Democrat in, say, Alabama. But it's even worse because it's just a small enclave, and the difference in Manhattan is something like 85-15 when they vote in federal elections. And so you're talking about a place that had a jury poll overwhelmingly of Trump haters and Democratic Party supporters. That's one of the weaknesses politically of this case. Now, I want to show you Trump's reaction to the guilty verdict that was handed down by the jury in Manhattan, because it's the message, I presume, that the Trump campaign is going to use. They're going to try and not just defensively insist that Trump hasn't really done anything meaningfully wrong or wrong at all, but they're going to affirmatively exploit this, or they're going to try to demonstrate that there is a massive and fundamental corruption in our justice system, that Democrats are using the justice system that Joe Biden has in his hands, that Democratic Party prosecutors have in their hands, to do everything possible to turn Trump into a criminal, a felon, a convicted felon before the election. In other words, to abuse the justice system for political ends. So let's just remember that Donald Trump has spent 5 decades in New York real estate and New Jersey real estate and ultimately national building and national entertainment. And the world of New York real estate is not a pristine world. It is a world where people constantly walk right up to the line of legality and often cross it. Now, I'm not saying Donald Trump ever crossed it, but it is very notable that in 50 years, with all kinds of business transactions of every sort, contracts with television networks to appear on television, contracts with all kinds of companies that he had his name on, oftentimes it ended up in civil litigation, which is very common for businesses, but never once. He went through his entire life, never once having been charged with a crime of any kind. And then suddenly Donald Trump becomes president. And now, by every poll, he is leading Joe Biden, not necessarily by a large amount, but in every poll consistently, he is the leader of the polls. And there's a lot of concern that Trump will beat Joe Biden. Suddenly now, he gets indicted in 4 separate proceedings, all under the control of Democrats, and he now becomes a convicted felon for the first time at the age of 77. Here is Trump's own response, which, as I said, I'm sure part of this is just anger. He had just walked out of the courtroom where he heard guilty verdict read 34 times. He has expressed all kinds of anger toward and criticisms of the judge who has presided over the case, who has become a liberal folk hero, as we showed you last night, precisely because he's been so vehemently anti-Trump in his treatment of the parties and the decisions he made and his comportment in the courtroom, because of course he's a Democrat in his bones. Nobody becomes a state court judge in Manhattan unless you have done a lot of work within the Democratic Party machine. It's a one-party town, not just New York City, but Manhattan. And it's obviously true. He has a daughter who's very active in the Democratic Party as well, but I don't even think you need to go to there to understand what this judge is. He proved it and demonstrated it over and over, and it's the reason why liberals adore him and love him so much. They even talk about him in terms of sexualizing him, as we showed you last night, the way they did with Robert Mueller and Michael Avenatti and Jack Smith. Anyone who they believe is eager to stop Trump and punish Trump, liberals turn into heroes, folk heroes, and start venerating them. It's just that it's very odd, at least in those other cases, you're talking about prosecutors or political activists. Here you're talking about a judge whose primary duty is to be partial and neutral and unbiased. And this judge has become a hero among liberals and a hated figure among conservatives because that everyone knows the way in which he presided over this trial. So here's Trump. And he talks a lot about this judge, even though Trump knows that in about 2 months, this judge will have to decide what his sentence should be, and that this judge has the power to send him to prison under the law, send him to jail under the law. He absolutely has that discretion, that autonomy. There's no question about that. And yet here's what Trump had to say, as obviously a lot of people were watching.
This was a disgrace. This was a rigged trial by a conflicted judge who was corrupt. It's a rigged trial, a disgrace. They wouldn't give us a venue change. We were at 5% or 6%. in this district, in this area. This was a rigged, disgraceful trial. The real verdict is going to be November 5th by the people. And they know what happened here, and everybody knows what happened here. You have a Soros-backed DA and the whole thing. We didn't do a thing wrong. I'm a very innocent man, and it's okay. I'm fighting for our country. I'm fighting for our Constitution. Our whole country is being rigged right now. This was done by the Biden administration in order to wound or hurt an opponent, a political opponent. And I think it's just a disgrace. And we'll keep fighting. We'll fight till the end, and we'll win, because our country's gone to hell. We don't have the same country anymore. We have a divided mess. We're a nation in decline, serious decline. Millions and millions of people pouring into our country right now, from prisons and from mental institutions, terrorists, and they're taking over our country. We have a country that's in big trouble. But this was a rigged decision right from day one, with a conflicted judge who should have never been allowed to try this case, never. And we will fight for our Constitution. This is long from over. Thank you very much.
Why should voters vote for convicted felons?
So that's clearly going to be their message, and I think it's a very effective message. As I said, for one thing, it was only when Trump was leading Joe Biden in all of the polls did Democrats start plotting to charge him with crimes, with felonies all over the country, even though he went his entire life, 50 or 60 years, in all kinds of industries, including major New York real estate, without ever being charged with a crime, let alone convicted of one. And we talk all the time about how our enemy countries, how the bad countries, one of the things they do is they try and imprison their opponents and dissidents. How much did we hear about Vladimir Putin purposely imprisoning his leading political opponents, including Alexei Navalny, and he was even accused of having him murdered? So when we start talking about political leaders being imprisoned by their opposing government, by a government they oppose, we already have this sense that that is not something that really happens in the United States. Now, I'm not a believer in the idea that presidents or former presidents should be immunized from the law. In fact, I wrote a book in 2011 called Liberty and Justice for Some, where I at length critiqued the way in which we have a two-tier justice system where the rich and the powerful are often immunized from prison sentences while we have the largest prison population in the country, and was documenting a lot of crimes that were committed as part of the war on terror and other crimes by leaders, and they were never prosecuted. Because we have a kind of unspoken rule in the United States that we don't prosecute former presidents or current presidents. And that's been the way it's been in American politics. So suddenly we have an aberration, a very radical aberration. And the question is going to be whether Americans perceive this radical aberration as an abuse of the justice system by an extremely liberal prosecutor in Manhattan who win in large part because a PAC was supporting him that received a massive donation from George Soros, knowing that PAC would then try and elect Alvin Bragg as the district attorney for Manhattan. And that's just a true statement. And they did it in the place that has the most liberals, the most Democrats, the most animosity toward Trump. In fact, I want to show you this breakdown from the Gotham Gazette in December of 2020. It's the final breakdown of the New York City vote tallies in the general election. And here you can see it says at the borough level, New York City is composed of 5 boroughs, one of which is Manhattan. Biden won in all except for Staten Island, where turnout increased by about 36,000 votes, or roughly 20%. And then it says this: Biden won over Trump by 84.5% to 14.5%. And in the Bronx by 82 to 17, in Brooklyn by 74 to 25. Now, I don't know if you can find many places of the size of Manhattan. It's much bigger and more populous than many American states that is this lopsided in terms of its propensity to be composed almost entirely of Democratic Party loyalists. And obviously that's where they brought the case. knowing that the jury pool would be composed of that, knowing that the judge would come from the Democratic Party machine. And then you add on to that the fact that so many other people, the U.S. Justice Department looked at these charges and said they're not going to bring the case. The prior district attorney, Cyrus Vance, looked at these charges and said he wouldn't bring the case. Alvin Bragg originally said this case can't be brought as felony charges, and he only changed his mind when prosecutors underneath him began screaming in public that he should do it, and they politically pressured him to do it, and then he finally brought it. And ultimately, the case is really about nothing other than hush payments to a porn star who alleges she had an affair with Donald Trump, even though previously she denied that, and a claim that in the books, in the internal books of the Trump organization, those payments to Michael Cohen, which then went to Stormy Daniels, were misclassified. So the case itself is just trivial, especially as a felony. And so, although I've always been a believer in trying to lift and eliminate this two-tier justice system where political elites and financial elites really are exempt in so many ways, not obviously absolutely, but overwhelmingly, I would be applauding this if I thought that this were fairly applied. The reality is there's only one person in all of the United States who would have been charged with 34 felonies or even one felony for having done this, and that person's name is Donald Trump. Democrats have been explicit about how they know that their best chance for winning is to ensure that Donald Trump becomes a felon before the election. Just to give you a sense for the absurdity of trying to suggest this was sort of the rule of law being applied equally, here from the New York Post in March 2020, and you can, 2022 rather, you can mock the New York Post if you want. The story that they did on Hunter Biden's laptop what turned out to be completely true, even though big tech and the media and the CIA all united to say it was Russian disinformation. And the facts that they're describing here are very easily verifiable. The headline is the Clinton campaign, the DNC, was fined by the Federal Election Commission for lying about the Steele dossier payments. Quote, the Federal Election Commission has fined both Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign and the Democratic National Committee for lying about how they spent money used to fund the now debunked Steele dossier on former President Donald Trump. The Clinton campaign and the DNC will be forced to pay $8,000 and $105,000 respectively for mislabeling payments that ultimately went to Fusion GPS, the consulting firm that commissioned the dossier according to FEC documents viewed by the Post. The fine stems from a complaint originally filed in 2018 by the Coolidge-Reagan Foundation, which was informed of the outcome on Tuesday. Now, obviously, that seems extremely similar to what Trump has been accused of. They wanted those payments to be hidden because they wanted to claim that they weren't the ones funding and instigating this fraudulent Steele dossier, and it turns out they absolutely were. And the intent was obviously to shield Hillary Clinton from damaging revelations, which is exactly the theory that they just convicted Trump on the basis of. Now, there's been polling done that essentially asks whether people would change their vote if Donald Trump ended up being convicted. And it's a little bit uninformative because people might have been thinking about the documents case or thinking about the post 2020 election. But nonetheless, there does show that this polling data does show that there could be a significant impact on Trump voters when they hear that he's been convicted of a crime. Here from ABC News on May 5th, 2024, quote, 80% of Trump's supporters said they would stick with him even if he's convicted of a felony in this case. But that leaves 20% of Trump voters who say they'd either reconsider their support, which was 16%, or withdraw at 4%, easily enough to matter in a close race. Now, here is a chart that the ABC tried to dramatize, which you can see at the top. Support for Trump, even if he's convicted among Trump supporters. 80% said, even if he's convicted of crimes, I'm still going to support him because they obviously perceive correctly that these are all politically motivated charges. But 16% said they would consider reconsidered supporting him, and 4% that said that they wouldn't. Now, I don't think this is very informative for the reason I said. I also think it's often the case that after primary elections that are very bitterly fought, and there was Ron DeSantis and Nikki Haley and a bunch of other Republicans trying to bash Trump, it's very easy to say after people are a little bit embittered if their candidate doesn't win, oh yeah, I might consider not voting for them in the general election. But it's almost always the case that Republicans will vote for the Republican presidential candidate. The question that I have is whether people are going to perceive this as a corrupt abuse of the criminal justice system and that this could all backfire on the Democratic Party. I think that's very possible. Just to give you one more poll, this is from the BBC at the end of May 2024, what Trump's conviction means for election. Polls indicate he is in a statistical dead heat with President Joe Biden and maintains a slight edge in many key swing states that will decide the election. But those surveys also provide evidence that this conviction might change all of that. In exit polls conducted during the Republican primaries this winter, double-digit numbers of voters said they would not vote for the former president if he were convicted of a felony. 32% of Republican voters in North Carolina's March primary said Trump would not be fit for the presidency if convicted. Now, again, they didn't specify convicted of what. And this is clearly the most trivial, the kind of most sleazy case that seems more than anything to be about Trump's personal life, which Americans have proven over and over they don't care about in political leaders. And it was also in the middle of a primary where Republicans who don't vote for Donald Trump feel some animosity toward him that they don't feel once he becomes the nominee, as he now has become. But the reason you can say with certainty that these prosecutions were politically motivated is that Democrats, both in Congress and on Democratic Party channels, have said over and over that they believe it's urgent that these cases go to trial before the election because they realize that their best chance to get Joe Biden reelected, to drag him over the finish line, is to try and turn Donald Trump into a felon. This has been the strategy all along. Here, just as one of countless examples, is a CNN segment from December 16th of 2023.
Agree with me that Smith and Judge Chutkan are acting based on the election schedule.
I do agree with you, Michael, and I think any fair-minded observer has to agree with that as well. Just look at Jack Smith's conduct in this case. The motivating principle behind every procedural request he's made has been speed, has been getting this trial in before the election. Let's take a couple examples. The trial date. The average federal conspiracy and fraud trial takes about 1.5 to 2 years between indictment and trial. In this case, we have dozens, hundreds of January 6 rioters caught on video, straightforward cases. They, too, were given about 1.5 to 2 years between indictment and trial. Jack Smith originally requested a trial date for Donald Trump, a far more complex case, 5 months out. He wanted a January trial. It was set for 2 months later.
So just to be clear about what's happening here, and we have a bunch of videos where these kind of liberal pundits are saying it's crucial to convict Donald Trump before the election because they're relying on those polls we just showed you and putting their hope in the fact that people who are primed to vote for Trump won't do it because they believe the legal system is so sacred and honorable and reliable that if they find him guilty, it means he's not fit for the presidency. But in this case, Jack Smith's political motivations were so overt that CNN's very pro-Democratic Party and anti-Trump commentator, former prosecutor Eli Honig, and others went on CNN and said, this is unseemly what Jack Smith is doing. He so clearly is desperate to get these verdicts and trials into a court far more quickly than an average case would take because he's looking at the election day and the impact that these convictions could have on election day, which obviously, to put it mildly, it shouldn't even be required to say it, is totally inappropriate for a prosecutor to be thinking about. And yet, even for some of these liberal lawyers who go on these liberal networks and usually read right from the DNC script, the way in which these prosecutions were so overtly politicized offended basically lawyers who practice in these courts, including prosecutors. They understand exactly how these cases normally work, and the speed with which Jack Smith was trying to bring these trials to a verdict before Election Day is almost unheard of. And that's why he's been unsuccessful. It's almost certain that those two trials that he is prosecuting will not come to a verdict, will not be tried and finished before Election Day, nor will the documents case in Florida. This is the only verdict of any of those 4 cases that we are likely to have before Election Day. Again, legally, we've gone over many times why this case is preposterous and so dubious. And Trump obviously has an appeal, and it's not all that uncommon for the New York appellate courts to overturn a conviction. They just overturned Harvey Weinstein's conviction and his trial. So it happens. They are very different courts, but that certainly, almost certainly won't happen before Election Day. And so the real question is, how will this be politically perceived? Will those polls turn out to be right, that even Republican voters, at least in small numbers, will abandon Trump if he's a convicted felon? Or will they have the view that I have, and that many other people have, that what this really is a politicized abuse of the criminal justice system to bring a case as a felony that has no right to be brought as a felony, for which there's no precedent, this theory that the prosecutors use to turn this into a felony, and that ultimately it's a trivial case that won't impact how Americans see Trump, but they very well might have an impact on how they look at the Biden administration, because of the very common view that we often enunciate about other countries, that one of the hallmarks of tyranny or abuse of power is when a current political leader tries to prosecute and imprison his political opponent. And I think there's a lot of facts surrounding this verdict that make that perspective very viable, if not most convincing. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.